The morning Charlotte Mercer arrived in Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory. The year was 1882, and the town smelled like horse sweat, sawdust, and the particular kind of desperation that settles into a place when the railroad has passed it by. She stepped off the stage with one carpet bag, a hat that had seen better days, and a letter of employment from a man named Gerald Holt, who ran the only school in 3 counties. She was 24 years old, had grown up in St. Louis in a house full of books and modest expectations, and had answered the advertisement in the Missouri Gazette because she had needed more than anything to be somewhere that was not where she had been. Dusty Creek was nowhere, which Charlotte had decided somewhere around the Cimarron River crossing was exactly what she required. The town was a single main street wide, with a general store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Crooked Spur, a small church with peeling white paint, and a schoolhouse that sat at the edge of town like it was thinking about leaving. There was a land office, a blacksmith, and a hotel that went by the name of the Frontier House, though it was really just a wide house with an extra floor and a sign. Charlotte stood on the planked sidewalk and counted the buildings and thought she had made either the best decision of her life or the worst, and that only time would settle the matter. The first person of consequence she met was not Louis Wallace. It was Eunice Barlow, who ran the Frontier House with the iron efficiency of a woman who had survived 3 husbands and a drought, and had no particular patience for anything she could not control. Eunice was 52, gray-haired, broad-shouldered, and took one look at Charlotte's carpet bag and sensible shoes, and declared that she would eat supper at the family table and not pay a penny extra for the bath water. Charlotte thanked her and meant it. The schoolhouse held 12 children, aged 6 to 14, and Gerald Holt turned out to be a nervous little man with ink-stained fingers who had been handling the upper grades himself, while the lower grades went unattended since the previous teacher, a Miss Adkins, had married a cattle buyer from Texas and departed without ceremony the previous spring. Charlotte settled into her role within 3 days with the practiced calm of someone who had been teaching Sunday school since she was 16 and knew that children responded to confidence whether or not you felt it. She met Louis Wallace on her 9th day in Dusty Creek. She had walked to the livery stable to inquire about renting a horse on Saturdays, because she had decided that if she was going to live in New Mexico Territory, she was going to understand the land, not simply observe it through window glass. The livery man, a stout fellow named Pete Garza, told her she was welcome to rent the bay mare named Sunday for a reasonable sum, and it was while she was arranging those terms that the door of the stable opened and Louis Wallace walked in with a gray roan horse, and a quiet that seemed to walk in ahead of him like a second presence. He was tall. Not exaggeratedly so, but tall enough that he had to angle his hat slightly when he came through the stable door. He wore a dark canvas jacket over a gray shirt, and his boots were worn but not careless, the leather creased in the way of boots that had covered real distance. He was 31 years old, though Charlotte did not know that yet. His face was angular and weathered, the kind of face that the western sun prints its signature on, and his eyes were a gray so dark they looked almost green in the low light of the stable. He nodded at Pete and did not notice Charlotte at first, which suited her perfectly fine because it gave her a moment to note that he moved with the unself-conscious ease of a man entirely comfortable in the physical world. "Shoes loose on the left front," he said to Pete, handing over the reins of the roan. "I noticed it on the Ridge Road this morning." "I'll have him sorted by afternoon," Pete said. Then he turned to Charlotte. "Miss Mercer, this here is Louis Wallace." "He runs the Wallace spread up past the creek bend. Louis, this is our new school teacher." Louis Wallace turned then and looked at her, and there was nothing remarkable about the moment except that his gaze was very direct, the kind of direct that does not perform itself. And Charlotte, who had been looked at with condescension and with admiration, and with the slightly glassy regard of men who were looking at what they wanted rather than who was there, found this kind of looking unusual enough that she held his eyes for a beat longer than social convention required. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Wallace," she said. That was the whole of their first conversation. She thought about it later that evening, sitting on the small porch outside her room at the frontier house, watching the sun go down over the mesa in colors that no painting she had ever seen in St. Louis had properly managed. She thought about it not because it had been remarkable, but because the quality of his attention, even in that brief exchange, had been remarkable, and she filed it away in the category of interesting things about this place and moved on. She taught her 12 students. She read in the evenings. She took Sunday out on Saturdays and rode the flat country south of town in widening circles, learning the land the way you learn a language, by immersion and repetition. She encountered Louis Wallace 3 more times in that first month, always briefly. Once at the general store, where he was buying flour and she was buying lamp oil, and they exchanged the measured pleasantries of people who are not yet sure what the other one is. Once outside the church on a Sunday morning when she was arriving and he was leaving early, though he held the door for her and she thanked him, and he said, "Good morning, Miss Mercer," with a particular clarity, as though he was saying it carefully. Once at the creek, where she had stopped to let Sunday drink, and he came from the opposite direction on the gray roan, whose name she had since learned was Calero, and they watered their horses side by side in the easy silence of 2 people who have not yet earned conversation, but are not uncomfortable in its absence. It was Eunice Barlow who filled in the outlines around Louis Wallace, in the way that small-town landladies do, not with malice, but with the understanding that a boarder who doesn't know the territory can get lost in it. His wife's name had been Mary. She had come to Dusty Creek at 19 from a family in Santa Fe, married Louis when he was 26 and she was 20, and for 4 years they had run the Wallace Ranch together, which sat on 340 acres above the creek bend and was, by Eunice's telling, one of the genuinely good operations in the territory. Mary Wallace had been well-liked, warm and capable, the kind of woman who brought soup to neighbors and could also ride a horse into rough country without complaint. She had died of fever 18 months ago, in the autumn. It had come fast, and it had been total, and Louis Wallace had not been the same since, though Eunice said this with the careful qualification that he had not become diminished exactly, more that some essential animation had gone quiet in him. He ran his ranch. He came to town when he needed to. He was decent and steady and reliable, and he kept everyone at arm's length with such natural composure that most people had stopped trying to cross it. "He doesn't talk about her," Eunice told Charlotte over cornbread and beans on a Tuesday evening, "which I respect. Some men talk too much when they're grieving and some men go quiet. He went quiet." Charlotte listened and said that sounded like a private man's private grief. "It is," Eunice agreed, "but there's private and then there's shut. I worry he's gone a little past private into shut." Charlotte didn't say anything to that. She thought it was not her business. She had her own closed rooms. What had brought Charlotte to New Mexico territory was not only the advertisement in the Gazette, though that had been the mechanism. What had brought her was a year that had contained, in too rapid a sequence, the death of her mother from consumption, the engagement of the man she had thought she might marry to a woman from a wealthier family, and the slow, suffocating realization that the life laid out for her in St. Louis would require her to become smaller than she already felt. She was not broken. She was very deliberately not broken. But she had needed the room to rebuild whatever came after, and she had needed that room to be large, which meant she had needed distance and open sky and work that mattered. The schoolhouse gave her the work. The sky gave her the room. She was beginning, cautiously and incrementally, to feel like herself again. It was the second month of her time in Dusty Creek when Louis Wallace rode up to the schoolhouse at 4 in the afternoon on a Wednesday with a problem that turned out not to be a problem but became, in retrospect, the hinge on which everything else turned. He had a boy. Tobias. He was 11, and he lived at the Wallace Ranch with his father, though he was not Louis's son by blood. He was the son of Louis's younger brother Daniel, who had gone to California 3 years prior seeking silver and had not returned and was, as far as anyone knew, probably either mining or dead. And the status of his living arrangements was such that he was not reliably sending money and not reliably present. And Tobias had been at the ranch since the age of 8 and was by all practical measures Louis Wallace's child, whatever the formal arrangements were. Tobias was supposed to be in school. He had not been in school. I should have brought him in September, Louis said. He was standing at the open door of the schoolhouse while Charlotte was cleaning the board, and he held his hat in his hands, which she would come to understand was a gesture he used when he was admitting to something. I kept thinking he'd settled enough to manage, but the truth is I let it go longer than I should have, and he needs to be in your classroom. Bring him Friday, Charlotte said. I'll put him in with the middle group until I can see where he is. Louis nodded once. I appreciate it. How is he? She asked, turning from the board. Generally, not just academically. The question seemed to catch him slightly off guard, not in an uncomfortable way, but in the way that a person looks when they are asked something that requires actual thought rather than a habitual answer. He's good, Louis said slowly. Quiet. Doesn't complain. Good with the horses, which I think is partly natural and partly because he uses them to avoid the things he doesn't want to face, the same way I do. He paused, and something in his expression shifted very slightly, a flicker of self-awareness that he seemed to allow out briefly before drawing it back. He lost his Aunt Mary 18 months ago. She was the closest thing to a mother he'd had. He doesn't talk about it. Like you, Charlotte said, and then immediately regretted the directness of it because she had not intended to say it out loud. But Louis Wallace didn't look offended. He looked at her with that very direct gaze and said, with a quietness that was its own kind of honesty, yes, like me. Charlotte turned back to the board and finished erasing it. Bring him Friday, she said again. Friday, he agreed and left. Tobias Wallace arrived on Friday morning on a brown horse that was entirely too large for him, and that he managed with a competence that Charlotte found immediately telling. He was dark-haired and wary-eyed, thin in the way of boys who forget to eat when they're thinking, and he looked at Charlotte with the specific assessment of a child who has been disappointed by adults and has developed a calibrated system for determining quickly whether disappointment is incoming. Charlotte met his look with no ceremony whatsoever, pointed to the middle row, and gave him an arithmetic problem on a slate. He got it right. She gave him a harder one. He stared at it for 3 minutes, then got it right with a method she hadn't taught that he'd apparently worked out himself. Where did you learn that approach? She asked. I didn't learn it, he said. I figured it. Show me how, she said. He showed her, with the halting pride of a child who has been told his unconventional methods were wrong by previous adults and was uncertain whether to trust that this one might think differently, and Charlotte said, That's actually a very efficient method. We'll see if it works on the next one. It did. Tobias Wallace came to school every day after that, and he was the best student she had, which she suspected Louis had not fully known, and she made a point of telling him so the next time she saw him, which was that same Friday afternoon when he came to collect the boy. She walked out to the yard while Louis was dismounting, and Tobias ran past her toward the horses with the unself-conscious efficiency of a child who knows exactly what he wants from an afternoon, and she said to Louis, He's exceptionally smart. You should know that. I'm not saying it to be kind. I'm saying it because he is. Louis looked after the boy with an expression Charlotte could not entirely read, something between pride and pain, the way you look at something that matters very much and that you are also slightly afraid of losing. His father was the bright one in the family, he said. Daniel always said so. I thought it was just a brother thing, but it's true. Tobias thinks his methods are wrong because they're different, Charlotte said. If you can, when he figures something out an unusual way, let him explain it to you. It matters to him that someone follows his thinking. Louis looked at her then, and there was something new in his expression, a quality of being genuinely seen by what she had said, and he held her gaze for a moment before saying simply, "I'll do that." The weeks moved forward in the rhythm of the territory, which was slower than St. Louis but more filled, somehow, with weather and animal sounds, and the particular quality of light that the high desert produced in every hour of the day. October turned to November, and the air sharpened, and the mesa went copper and gold, and Charlotte found herself standing at her window in the mornings longer than she needed to, watching the land wake up. Louis Wallace brought Tobias to school now on Mondays and collected him on Fridays, the boy staying with Pete Garza's family in town during the week, an arrangement they had made when it became clear that the ranch-to-town ride was too much for daily attendance. On those Monday mornings and Friday afternoons, Louis and Charlotte spoke for longer and longer stretches, not about anything large, about Tobias's progress, about the coming winter, about the horse fair at Cimarron that Louis had attended, about a book that Charlotte was teaching from that Louis had read as a young man in his father's house. He was well read. That surprised her, and then she felt the surprise itself was worth examining, because she had made an assumption that the land and the books were separate, that this country produced one kind of man and the East produced another, and Louis Wallace sat quietly on the boundary of that assumption and made it feel smaller every time she talked to him. He had not mentioned Mary, not after that first conversation at the schoolhouse door. Charlotte had not asked. But she thought about what Eunice had said, about shut versus private, and she watched Louis Wallace with the careful attention she gave everything she wanted to understand. And what she saw was a man who was fully functional and fundamentally kind, and who had placed himself in a kind of internal exile from his own heart. The way you seal a room after something irreplaceable is lost because you cannot stand the emptiness of it, but you also cannot stand to fill it with lesser things. She recognized it. Not the grief for a spouse, which was not something she had experienced, but the sealed room. She knew something about sealed rooms. The first time they had a real conversation that had nothing to do with Tobias was in late November, on a Saturday afternoon when Charlotte was riding Sunday south along the Mesa Road, and came around a bend to find Louis Wallace sitting on Calero on the high ground above a wide dry wash, looking west. He heard her coming and turned, and she had the quick impression that she had interrupted something private, but he did not look displeased, only slightly returned from wherever he had been. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I didn't know anyone rode up this way on Saturdays," she said, drawing Sunday alongside. "I come up most Saturdays," he said. Then, after a pause, "I didn't know you rode this road. I've been working my way further out every week," she said, "learning the country." He turned back to look west, and she followed his gaze. The wash below was lined with cottonwoods that had gone gold, and beyond them the land opened into a wide plain that ended at a wall of red rock, and the whole of it was lit by a November sun that was already low and turning everything amber. "It's extraordinary," Charlotte said, not performing the appreciation but feeling it plainly and letting it out. "The territory gets into you," Louis said. "Once it does, you can't be somewhere flat without feeling something's missing." "Have you always been here? Born in Kansas. Came out at 19 with my father and Daniel. My father died 2 years after we arrived. Heart." He said it without the performing of grief, the simple factual way of a man who has filed the loss into its proper drawer. "I stayed because by then the land was mine, and because I couldn't think of anywhere I'd rather be." "I understand that feeling," Charlotte said, "even though I've only been here 9 weeks. He looked at her, and there was a slight adjustment in his expression, the very beginning of a smile that he kept contained, and Charlotte thought it was perhaps the most interesting face she had ever watched, the way feeling moved through it in small, careful waves, nothing wasted or performed. "Where do you think you'll be in a year?" he asked. It was a real question. She considered it honestly. "I don't know," she said. 6 months ago I couldn't have told you where I'd be in 9 weeks, so I've stopped making those plans." "Something happened," he said. It was not exactly a question. "Several somethings," she said, "in a row." He nodded, and the nod carried no pity, only the simple acknowledgement of one person who has survived a sequence of losses to another. "The territory is good for that," he said. "The scale of it. It makes you feel like the distance between where you were and where you are is actual and not just imagined." Charlotte looked at the red rocks and the amber light. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." They rode back to town separately but at the same pace, not quite together but not apart either, and Charlotte thought about that the whole evening. December came in cold, and the children in the schoolhouse pressed their faces to the window glass when the first real snow fell, thin and dry and swept sideways by wind off the mesa. Charlotte let them out 15 minutes early and stood in the yard watching them run home, and then stood alone in the snow for a long moment because it was beautiful, and because she was 24 years old and had survived her year of somethings and was standing in New Mexico territory in the first snow of December and felt, for the first time in a long time, something uncomplicated and clean. Louis Wallace saw her standing there from across the road. He had been at the land office and was heading for his horse, and he stopped. She didn't see him stop and stand looking at her. She only turned when she was ready to go inside, and found him there across the road, and lifted a hand in greeting, and he lifted his in return and then went on to his horse. But Eunice Barlow saw it from the window of the Frontier house and did not say anything about it, because Eunice Barlow was a woman who understood timing. The Christmas social at the church was on the 22nd of December, and the whole of Dusty Creek attended because the whole of Dusty Creek always attended, and because it was the only formal gathering of the season, and because Mrs. Hartley brought her apple cake, and that alone would have drawn attendance. Charlotte wore her good dress, which was dark blue wool with cream trim at the cuffs, and put her hair up in the style she had liked in St. Louis, and then felt slightly vain about it and took it down partially, and then put it back up because she was being ridiculous. Tobias was there with Louis, which Charlotte had not expected. The boy cleaned up and wearing a proper shirt with evident reluctance, and he spotted Charlotte immediately and crossed the room to tell her about a book Pete's oldest son had lent him, something about whaling that he'd been reading all week. "I don't know why a person would get on a boat that size," Tobias announced, "when a horse is much more sensible." "Different kinds of distance," Charlotte said, and Tobias considered this with the seriousness he gave everything, and then said that was a fair point. Louis arrived beside them while they were talking, and he was wearing a dark jacket that fit him properly and had shaved with more than usual care, and Charlotte noticed this the way she noticed things, quietly and without making it visible. "He's been talking about that book all week," Louis told her. "I made him read the first 3 chapters out loud so I could hear what was in it." "He has a very good reading voice," Charlotte said. "I know," Louis said, with the uncomplicated warmth of a man talking about a child he loved, and Charlotte felt the warmth of it like a change in temperature, the specific way that watching someone love someone else generously makes the world feel more inhabitable. They talked through most of the social, not exclusively but in overlapping stretches. Tobias went off with Pete's boys, and Louis and Charlotte found themselves standing near the punch bowl in a conversation that moved through the schoolhouse budget situation, through Louis's concerns about the winter water supply on the upper range, through a discussion about Missouri that Charlotte started and that Louis extended with a story about a cattle trader from Kansas City who had briefly tried to swindle his father and had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered by the elder Wallace that the story had passed into local legend. He was funny. Charlotte had not known that. He told the story with the dry, understated timing of someone who knows exactly how ridiculous a thing is and trusts you to see it too. And Charlotte laughed, properly laughed, the way she had not laughed since St. Louis and maybe before that, and felt the laughing open something in her chest that she had not known was closed. He looked at her when she laughed, and his eyes held an expression she would think about for a long time afterward, something unguarded and warm and very slightly surprised, as though he had not expected to cause it, and found that it mattered to him that he had. They walked back from the church in the same direction because they were both going toward the south end of town, and the night was cold and very clear. the stars' enormous overhead in the way they only got in places far from city light. Tobias walked between them, telling them about the wailing book again until Louis said, with great patience, that 3 chapters of it out loud had been sufficient, and that the rest could be discussed in the morning. Tobias went quiet and looked up at the stars instead, with the particular quality of a child who is comfortable in silence because the adults around him are. At the point where Louis's horse was tied and Charlotte's route to the frontier house diverged, they stopped. "Thank you for talking to him about the arithmetic," Louis said. "He told me about the method. We tried it on a problem I set him. He was very pleased with himself." "He should be," Charlotte said. "It was a good solution." A pause settled between them, not uncomfortable but weighted slightly, the specific weight of a conversation that has more in it than the words that have been said. "Good night, Miss Mercer," Louis said. "Good night, Mr. Wallace," she said. She walked back to the frontier house and sat on her bed in her good blue dress for a while before changing, and did not think anything in particular, which was its own kind of answer. January was hard. A cold front came down from the north and sat over the territory for 2 weeks, temperatures dropping low enough at night that the water in the washbowl on Charlotte's dresser froze before morning. The school attendance dropped as families on the outer spreads kept their children home. Charlotte sat with her remaining 6 students and was thorough and undeterred and kept the stove fed. Louis came to collect Tobias on the first Friday after the cold broke, and he looked tired in a way that was different from his usual composure, the kind of tired that is physical and recent and real. "Rough 2 weeks?" Charlotte asked. "Lost 2 steers," he said. "The pond on the south range froze over before I caught it. They broke through." He said it flatly, but she could hear the weight of it. "Could have been worse, was worse for the Hendersons. They lost 7. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her with the direct gaze she had come to know well. "You mean that?" he said. "I do," she said. "Most people say it and mean something more like an acknowledgement," he said. "You mean it the other way." "I grew up reading too many books," Charlotte said. "I take things seriously." "That's not a flaw," Louis said. "My mother thought so," Charlotte said, and then was surprised that she'd said it, a reference to her mother, to that particular tender place. She looked down at the papers she was stacking on her desk and let the moment pass. But Louis didn't let it pass entirely. He said quietly, "How long has she been gone?" Charlotte looked up. "A year and 3 months." He nodded, and in the nod was the understanding of someone who counts months the same way. "I'm sorry," he said, and she could tell he meant it the other way. February brought the first thaw, and then a late snow, and then genuine warmth that arrived on a Tuesday in the last week of the month like something that had been promised and was finally making good. Charlotte opened the schoolhouse windows for the first time, and the air that came in smelled like wet earth and something green and beginning. And 4 of her students looked at the open windows with the astonishment of people who had forgotten that windows could do that. Tobias was back to full attendance and had devoured the wailing book, and moved on to a collection of natural philosophy essays that Charlotte had in her personal library, and had lent him somewhat on impulse, not certain it was the right choice. And he had come back the next week with 17 questions written on a piece of brown paper in his very particular cramped handwriting. And Charlotte had answered each one in turn with the pleasure of someone who has found the exact right student for the exact right material. She told Louis about it that Friday. "He had 17 questions," she said, "written down and numbered." Something moved across Louis Wallace's face, a complex thing, love and loss and pride and something grateful, all in a brief passage. "Mary used to write lists," he said. "She said things written down don't get lost." He stopped, and Charlotte understood that he had said something he had not fully intended to, had opened a door that was usually kept closed. She did not rush through it. She simply said, "She sounds like she was very organized." "She was," Louis said. "She was also very good at chaos." Both at the same time. A pause. "She would have liked you." It was such a simple thing to say, and it carried so much in it that Charlotte had to look away briefly at the windows and the beginning spring outside them. "Thank you," she said, when she was steady. Louis put his hat back on and called for Tobias with the regular tone of a Friday afternoon, and nothing more was said about Mary. But something had shifted, some very slight change in the texture of the space between them, and Charlotte felt it and knew Louis felt it, and neither of them spoke to it directly, because neither of them was ready. March came in, and with it came the spring gathering, a 3-day affair at the larger Henderson Ranch, where the ranchers and homesteaders of the surrounding area brought livestock to sell and trade, caught up on 3 months of accumulated news, and generally reminded each other that they were not alone out there on the land. Charlotte went on Saturday, taken by Eunice in the Frontier House buckboard, and found herself in the middle of more people than she'd seen since arriving, 200 at least, spread across the Henderson pasture with horses and cattle in temporary pens and children running in all directions and the smell of food from half a dozen cooking fires. It was genuinely wonderful. Charlotte stood in the middle of it and felt Dusty Creek cease to be a town she was visiting and become a place she was from, or becoming from, which was close enough. She saw Louis across the gathering in the late morning, talking to a group of ranchers about something serious involving water rights, and he caught her eye from a distance and lifted his chin in acknowledgement, and she nodded back and continued on to where Tobias was showing her 3 different horse breeds, with the focused enthusiasm of a boy who has found his true subject. They had supper at the same long table the way everyone did, the food set out communally and people sitting where they landed. Louis sat across from Charlotte, with Tobias beside him, and they talked through the whole meal with the easy naturalness of people who have logged enough small conversations to have built something without noticing they were building it. "You're staying," said Eunice, next to Charlotte, not quietly enough. Charlotte looked at her. "In Dusty Creek," Eunice said, with entirely unconvincing innocence. "You're staying, I can tell. You've stopped looking like someone on a visit." Louis had heard this. Charlotte could tell by the very careful quality of his attention to his plate. "I haven't made any formal decision," Charlotte said. "No," Eunice agreed, "but you will." Charlotte looked across the table and found Louis looking back at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and it was one of those moments that contains its own small, complete world. April arrived with green grass on the lower slopes, and the cottonwoods in full leaf along the creek, and the light that particular shade of gold that the territory reserved for spring mornings. And Charlotte Mercer was 24 years old and in love, and not entirely ready to admit it. She had known it for a month. She had known it, specifically, on the Friday afternoon in late March, when Louis had arrived to collect Tobias, and Charlotte had been dealing with a difficult moment, because 9-year-old Jonas Hendricks had come to school that day with a bruise on his jaw that he said was from a fall, and that Charlotte was not certain was from a fall. And she had spent the day watching him with a quiet particular concern, and had not fully resolved what to do about it when Louis arrived and found her standing in the schoolyard with a crease between her brows that she did not know was visible. He had said, "What's wrong?" immediately, directly, without preamble. And she had looked at him and said, "Jonas Hendricks," and he had understood immediately because he was a man who paid attention to the world around him, and he had said quietly, "I know his father. I'll ride out tomorrow." "I don't want to make an accusation that you're not accusing anyone," Louis said firmly. "I'm riding out to talk to a neighbor whose boy goes to the school, that's all, and if something needs addressing, I'll address it." He did ride out. Jonas Hendricks came to school on the following Monday with no new bruises, and over the next 2 weeks the boy's whole aspect shifted slightly, became less watchful, more present. Whatever Louis had said to the Hendricks father, it had worked. Charlotte had not asked what it was, and Louis had not elaborated, and Charlotte had thought, standing in her schoolroom watching Jonas laugh at something, that Louis Wallace was a man who did the necessary thing without requiring applause for it. And she had known then that she loved him and had been, since that moment, quietly managing the information. She was not managing it because she didn't want it to be true. She was managing it because she wasn't certain it was safe. She had been wrong about safety before. She had believed in a future and had it dissolve, and she had built herself back from the dissolving, and she was cautious about the materials now, cautious about what she built and what she built it on. What she knew about Louis Wallace was that he was fundamentally good. What she was uncertain about was whether his closed room had enough give in it to open for a second time, whether he was the kind of man who loved once and that was the whole of his capacity, or whether, under the grief and the composure and the long quiet of 18 months of solitude, there was something that was moving slowly toward the light. She thought there was. She was not certain. It was on a Monday morning in the last week of April that Charlotte stood outside with the children during the morning break, and Pete Garza's youngest daughter Sarah was telling the group about the Ridge Road, about how her brother had ridden up to the high ridge above the Wallace land and had said you could see 3 counties from the top. "Is that true?" Charlotte asked, looking northwest at the ridge in question, which rose sharply above the creek bend and was visible from town as a dark line against the sky. "Thomas says it is," Sarah insisted. "He says on a clear day you can see the Rio Hondo." Charlotte looked at the ridge. She had not been up that road. It was west of her usual Saturday circuit, and the approach looked steep, and Pete had told her it was rougher going than the Mesa Road. She thought, standing in the schoolyard in the April morning light, that she would very much like to see 3 counties from a high place on a clear day. That Friday afternoon, when Louis came for Tobias, Charlotte had papers to return and a question about Tobias's next assigned reading, and they talked longer than usual, standing in the schoolyard while Tobias was helping Pete's boy close up the water trough. The light was long and warm, and the cottonwoods along the creek were making their full spring sound, a kind of rustling that Charlotte had decided was one of the best sounds in the territory. "I've been told you can see 3 counties from the ridge above your property," Charlotte said, because she was working on being a person who said the things she was thinking. "Is that true?" Something crossed Louis Wallace's face. It was quick and it was complex, and Charlotte caught it and held it in her attention, a brief tightening around the eyes, a slight stillness that went beyond his normal composure, and then a careful returning to neutral, the way a man composes himself when something has surprised him inward. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's true." He held her gaze for a second. Then he turned without another word and walked to the stable, and Charlotte watched him go and thought she had perhaps said the wrong thing, that the ridge meant something she hadn't understood, and she felt a small, cold worry settle in. She began walking toward the frontier house. She had not gotten 20 feet when she heard him. "Miss Mercer," she turned. Louis Wallace was standing at the stable door with his hat in his hand, which she had come to know was the gesture he used when he was admitting something. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. She didn't understand at first. Then he disappeared into the stable and she stood in the yard, and 5 minutes later he came out leading 2 horses, Calero and Sunday, who Pete had saddled before Charlotte could process what was happening. Louis came to stand beside them both in the afternoon light, holding both sets of reins, and he looked at her with the expression she would later tell Eunice about, the one that was the most honest and the most vulnerable thing she had ever seen on a grown man's face, that particular combination of will and hope, and the specific courage of a person who is afraid and doing the thing anyway. He had not said a word. He had saddled 2 horses. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment, at his face and at the 2 horses and at the ridge in the northwest distance, and she understood. She took Sunday's reins. They rode west in the late afternoon light without much conversation, Tobias having been settled with Pete's family for the weekend with such calm practicality by Louis that the boy had barely registered it as unusual. And the road west of the creek bend was narrower and rougher than Charlotte's usual routes, rising sharply through scrub oak and juniper as they gained elevation. Louis rode a half-length ahead on the steep sections, knowing the footing, and Charlotte followed and watched him and thought about what Eunice had said, about shut versus private, about the difference. When they reached the ridge, the last of the evening light was hitting it from the west at a nearly horizontal angle, and the view was exactly what Sarah Garza had promised, and more. 3 counties, certainly, and more than that. A vast westward openness that went all the way to the horizon in a series of mesas and valleys and red rock formations, and the distant silver thread of the river. And the sky above it all was going from blue to violet to a deep gold at the horizon in gradations that made the whole thing look like the work of someone who had more colors available than the rest of creation. Charlotte sat on Sunday at the edge of the ridge and looked at it for a long time. Louis stopped Calero a few feet away and looked out too, and she could feel the particular quality of his silence, different from his usual silence, weighted with something she could feel even across the distance between their horses. "You haven't brought anyone here since Mary," she said. She said it quietly and without accusation as a simple recognition. He did not answer for a moment. Then, "No, I'm glad you brought me." He turned to look at her, and the light was on his face, that extraordinary western evening light that shows everything, and she saw that his eyes were bright in a way that was not entirely from the wind. "She loved it here," he said. "We used to come up on Saturday evenings when we could. She said it was the only place she'd found where the world was big enough to hold everything she felt." Charlotte felt the grief in it and held it carefully. "She was right," she said. "I couldn't come back," he said, "for a long time, and then I started coming alone, and that was different, but it was still." He stopped, looked west again. "I thought it would be easier alone. It wasn't, it was just emptier." The horses shifted. The light deepened. "Louis," Charlotte said, and his name in her mouth was something she had not tried before, the first name, and she felt the small significance of it and let it stand. He looked at her. "I'm not trying to replace anything," she said. "I wouldn't want to, and I'm not asking you for anything you can't give." She held his gaze steadily because she had learned steadiness from him. "But I want you to know that I've been here 9 weeks and I have thought about you more than I've thought about anything else, and I would like to stop pretending that isn't true." The silence that followed was the longest she had experienced with him. The wind moved the juniper on the slope below. Calero tossed his head. The sky went another shade deeper. "I didn't think I was finished," Louis said finally, and his voice was low and careful, as though he was locating words he had not needed before. "Feeling? I thought maybe I was. I thought maybe the part of me that could want a future had gone with her." He paused. "And then you stood in the snow outside the schoolhouse in December, and I stood across the road watching you look at it like it was the most extraordinary thing you'd ever seen, and something came back that I had thought was gone." Charlotte did not trust herself to speak immediately. She looked at the view, at the impossible distance of it, at the world laid out below in the evening gold. "I'm scared," he said. It was the most direct thing she had ever heard him say. "I want to be honest about that." "I'm scared too," she said. "I came out here to rebuild something, and I'm not entirely sure what I was building until very recently." "What were you building?" he asked. She looked at him and let the honesty be total. "Somewhere to be loved that wasn't already in someone else's shape." He was quiet for a moment. Then he moved Calero alongside Sunday until they were close enough that he could reach out and take her hand, which he did, quietly, and with the care of a man doing a deliberate and serious thing. His hand was large and warm and very certain, and Charlotte felt the certainty of it move through her like water finding its level. "I want to start slow," he said. "I want to do this properly." "So do I," Charlotte said. They sat on the ridge with their hands joined until the light was nearly gone and the first stars appeared, and then they rode back down the ridge road in the dark, and Louis knew the way well enough to lead them safely, and Charlotte followed his horse's shape in the darkness with a feeling she did not have a word for and did not need one. Starting slow meant what they said it would mean, which Charlotte appreciated because it was exactly right. May passed in a series of particular moments, not dramatic but real. Louis bringing her wildflowers from the upper range that he had no particular reason to pick, except that they were there and so was she. Sunday evenings on the porch of the frontier house after the week's business was settled, talking in the long light. Tobias, who was perceptive in the way of children who watch adults for safety, beginning to look at Charlotte with an expression that was part assessment and part something quietly hopeful. One Sunday evening Louis told her about meeting Mary, about how she had come to Dusty Creek with her aunt to visit, and had stayed an extra week for no reason she would ever admit was about him, and how it had taken him 3 attempts to say the right thing because he was not, by nature, quick with words, and how Mary had eventually told him he was taking too long and said what she meant herself. Charlotte laughed. "That sounds efficient." She was efficient, Louis said, with the comfortable warmth of a man who has moved from the sharp edge of grief to a place where the love and the loss coexist without canceling each other. "I've been thinking you're something like that too." "I've been accused of directness," Charlotte allowed. "I mean it as a compliment," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her in the evening light and said, "I'm not scared the same way I was on the ridge." "What way are you scared now?" she asked. "The good way," he said. "The way where you want something and are afraid of how much you want it." Charlotte looked at the horizon, at the last strip of orange over the mesa, and said, "I know that particular fear very well." His hand found hers on the porch railing, and they sat with the evening coming in around them and the sounds of Dusty Creek settling into night. June brought heat, dry and full and pressing, and the water in the upper creek dropped, and Louis rode the fence lines on the South Range checking water sources, and Tobias was out of school for the summer and rode with him on those mornings, learning the land the way Louis had learned it, by being in it. Charlotte spent the summer mornings reading and writing letters and preparing the next year's school materials, and the afternoons often found her at the Wallace Ranch, which she had begun visiting on the invitation of Louis and under the enthusiastic escort of Tobias, who had decided that Miss Mercer's presence at the ranch was a significant improvement to his circumstances. The ranch was beautiful. She had not been fully prepared for it, the way the house sat in the crook of the land, backed by the ridge and fronted by the wide pasture where the creek ran, the cottonwoods older and larger than anywhere else she'd seen, the vegetable garden on the south side that Louis tended with a methodical care that surprised her the first time she saw it. "You garden," she said. "Mary started it," he said simply. "It seemed wrong to let it go." Charlotte stood in the garden and looked at the careful rows, the evidence of consistent tending, and felt the love in it and the grief in it and the choice in it, the choice to care for something even after its original reason had changed. And she thought that was perhaps the most accurate thing she had seen of who Louis Wallace really was. She cooked supper at the ranch on 3 separate occasions in June, because Tobias mentioned on the first visit that Louis's biscuits were, with respect, not good, and Louis had not disagreed, and Charlotte had produced biscuits from the stone-hearted ranch stove that Tobias had eaten 4 of, and Louis had looked at with an expression of honest relief. "You can cook," Louis said. "I had a mother who insisted on it," Charlotte said, "which I resented at the time and am now deeply grateful for." After supper on those evenings, with Tobias gradually claiming the couch for sleep in the way of children who are pushed past tired, Louis and Charlotte sat on the ranch porch with the night air full of insects and the creek sound coming from the trees, and talked. Long, slow talks that were the architecture of knowing someone, the accumulation of stories and opinions and small histories that together build a person into someone real and specific rather than general. She told him about her mother, about the slow months of the illness, about the particular kind of hard it was to watch someone strong become small, about the man she had not married, whom she described honestly as someone she had mistaken for a better version of himself, and about the year in St. Louis after her mother died, the suffocating smallness of a life that had closed around her like a fist. Louis listened with his particular quality of full attention, not filling the silences with reassurance but simply receiving what she said, and when she was finished he said, "The territory does something to grief, changes its shape. Not smaller exactly, but different." "Yes," Charlotte said, "different." "I'm glad you came," he said, "to Dusty Creek. I know that's not a novel thing to say." "It doesn't need to be novel," she said. "I'm glad I came too." July was the month Louis finally asked her to dinner properly, with formality and intention, which made Tobias roll his eyes in the way of a boy who considered the whole enterprise obvious and overdue. He rode to town on a Tuesday morning, which was not his usual day, and went to the frontier house where Charlotte was on the porch with her reading, and he stood at the foot of the porch steps and said, with the care of a man who has composed his words, "I would like to take you to supper at the hotel dining room on Saturday, if you're willing." Charlotte looked up from her book and met his eyes and the effort in them, the deliberate step he was marking with this, and she said, "I would like that very much, Mr. Wallace." He nodded once. Then, Louis, she agreed. The dinner at the Frontier House dining room was the most formal meal Charlotte had sat to since St. Louis, which was not saying a great deal because the Frontier House dining room had checked tablecloths and Eunice's good china. But there was something in the formality that mattered because they had chosen it. Louis wore his best jacket and had the look of a man who was nervous in a way that he was managing with great dignity. And Charlotte wore the dark blue wool dress and had done her hair properly, and felt the reality of the evening like something solid under her feet. They talked and ate, and the talking was easy the way all their talking had become easy, and over the course of 2 hours there was a moment, over the apple pie that Eunice had made with pointed unsubtlety, when Louis reached across the table and put his hand over hers and said, "I need you to know that this means something to me, that you mean something to me, that I'm not practicing at this." Charlotte turned her hand over under his and held it. "I know you're not," she said. "I thought I should say it plainly," he said. "I love that you said it plainly," she said. He looked at her with everything showing. All the composed reserve dropped for a moment, just a man and what he felt. "I love you," he said. "I want to say that plainly too." Charlotte felt the words land in the center of her, warm and certain and real, and she said, "I love you too, Louis. I have for quite a while." He let out a breath that she realized had been held. "How long?" he asked. "Since Jonas Hendricks," she said. His mouth moved toward the smile he so rarely let out fully, and this time he let it out, and it transformed his face completely, made him look younger and lighter, and Charlotte thought it was the best thing she had seen in a very long time. "I should have said it sooner," he said. "You said it when you were ready," she said. "That's the right time." August was the month of everything deciding itself at once. Louis asked her to marry him on the last Saturday of August, on the ridge. They had ridden up twice since the first time, the three of them once with Tobias, and once just the two of them on a warm July evening, and the ridge had become something that belonged to all three of them in different proportions, which felt right in a way that Charlotte could not have planned. He had no ring, which he apologized for before she could say anything. "I thought about writing to Santa Fe for one," he said, "but it seemed wrong to wait on a ring. I can get one later if you want, but I didn't want to wait on the asking." Charlotte looked at him in the August morning light, at the man she had watched for 9 months become real to her, and said, "I don't need a ring to answer. Ask me." "Charlotte Mercer," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality she would never get tired of, a careful reverence. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. She said it without hesitation, and without the managed composure she had maintained for the whole of her time in Dusty Creek, and he crossed the short distance between their horses, and she was in his arms with a naturalness that felt like the resolution of something long in motion, and the view from the ridge was doing its ordinary, extraordinary work around them, 3 counties wide and endless. He kissed her and she kissed him back, and it was their first kiss, and it was at the top of the world, and it tasted like the wind off the mesa, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing that needed saying. Tobias, when they told him that afternoon at the ranch, sat very still for a moment with the expression of a boy processing something large. Then he looked at Charlotte with those dark, careful eyes and said, "Does this mean you're staying?" "Yes," Charlotte said. "For always." "For always," she said. He nodded once, very much like Louis, and then went back to his book, and Charlotte and Louis exchanged a look over his head that was full of everything. They married in September, on a Saturday. in the church with the peeling white paint, and the whole of Dusty Creek was present, plus a number of ranching families from the surrounding territory, and Eunice Barlow in her good dress, which she wore only 3 times a year, and which indicated the gravity of her regard for the occasion. Charlotte wore a cream dress that she had made herself over the preceding month with the help of Eunice and the wife of the land agent, who turned out to be an excellent seamstress, and it was simple and well made, and she felt herself in it the way she felt herself in the territory. Arrived. Louis stood at the altar with Tobias beside him, both of them in good jackets, both of them with the particular stillness of people who are fully present. And when Charlotte walked down the aisle on the arm of Gerald Holt, because there was no one else available, and Gerald had been both touched and slightly terrified by the request, Louis looked at her with an expression that she felt in the roots of her. The preacher said what preachers said, and they said what couples say, and when Louis said, "I will," his voice was completely steady, the voice of a man who has located his certainty and stands in it without qualification. And when Charlotte said, "I will," she heard her own voice steady and warm and decided, the voice of a woman who has chosen and is completely at peace with the choosing. Eunice threw rice in a quantity that suggested she had been saving it specifically. The reception was in the church hall, and it went on until well past dark, with fiddle music and dancing, and a great deal of food, and the particular celebration of a small community that takes its own occasions seriously. Louis was not a dancer, which Charlotte discovered and did not mind because she was also not particularly a dancer, and they stood at the edge of the floor watching Pete Garza dance with a precision that belied his size, and Louis kept his arm around her shoulders in the easy, anchored way of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. Tobias danced with Sarah Garza, with the focused effort of a boy doing a thing he considers slightly beneath his dignity, but is performing for the social requirement. And Charlotte watched and felt the particular joy of watching a child who has been solemn begin to be light. The Wallace Ranch was hers now. She felt it the morning after they married when she stood on the porch in the early light and looked at the pasture and the creek and the ridge above and thought, "This is mine." Not owned exactly, but belonging to, the way you belong to a place that fits the shape of you. She kept teaching. There had been some mild opinion in Dusty Creek that a married woman of the schoolteacher variety would naturally step back from the position. But Charlotte had continued without ceremony, and Louis had backed her without qualification. And Gerald Holt, who needed her more than he needed convention, had been quietly relieved. The school year started again in October, and Charlotte had 13 students now, one more than the year before. A girl named Lucia whose family had arrived from Texas over the summer, and who was very bright and very reserved, and reminded Charlotte slightly of Tobias in her first weeks. October and November settled into the pace of a married life, which was a different rhythm than anything Charlotte had known, steadier and fuller, the days structured around shared work and shared meals, and the particular quiet of being with someone in a house where you have both decided to be. They fell into their domestic landscape with a naturalness that Charlotte later told Eunice she had not expected, not because she had doubted the choice, but because she had not been certain how two people with their particular quantities of self-sufficiency and privacy would navigate the shared space. The answer turned out to be, very well. Louis was a man who understood that space and presence could coexist, who could sit in the same room in silence without making the silence a question, who was attentive without being consuming, who asked what she thought and then actually listened to the answer. Charlotte was a woman who had her own opinions and her own schedule and her own inner world, and Louis not only respected this but seemed genuinely to admire it, seemed to take a specific pleasure in her being fully herself in the way that generous people do. Tobias was the daily heartbeat of the household. He came to school each day with Charlotte, riding together in the morning cool, and the ride to school became its own particular time, conversation or silence according to the day, and Charlotte found herself knowing him the way she knew the land, by immersion and repetition, until his thoughts and his ways became as natural to her as the cottonwood sound and the mesa light. She had not imagined becoming a mother by this route and this particular arithmetic, but when she sat by his lamp at night helping him with his reading and felt his focus and his trust, she understood that the form of the thing mattered less than the substance, and the substance was unmistakable. She spoke to Louis about it one night in November, in the way that they spoke when Tobias was asleep, the late-night conversations that were the most honest of their day. "I love him," she said simply. "I want him to know that, not just as my student or as your nephew, as mine too." Louis set down the feed ledger he'd been working on and looked at her with the full quality of his attention. "I'll talk to him," he said. "I'd rather tell him myself," Charlotte said. "Then tell him." She did, on a Saturday morning when they were both in the barn and Louis was elsewhere on the property, not by arrangement but by the way things work out when they need to. She was grooming Sunday and Tobias was checking Calero's back left shoe, which he had taken as his personal responsibility, and she said, into the comfortable routine of the work, "Tobias, I want you to know that you're mine too." Not in place of anything, in addition to it. Tobias went still over the hoof. He did not look up immediately. "I know my mother was your Aunt Mary," Charlotte said, "and I'm not asking you to forget that or to call me anything you're not comfortable with, but I want you to know that what I feel for you is not conditional on the arrangement or the circumstances. It just is." He put the hoof down carefully and straightened and looked at her with those dark eyes that saw everything. "I know," he said. "Good," she said. A pause. Then, with the careful nonchalance of a boy who is feeling something large and is managing it with characteristic dignity, "I would be all right if you wanted to be called something. By me. Not mother but something." Charlotte kept her breathing even. "What would feel right to you?" He thought about it with total seriousness. "Charlie," he said, "because it's yours but it's different." Charlotte looked at him, this serious, quiet, extraordinary boy, and said, "Charlie is fine with me." He nodded and went back to checking the shoe, and Charlotte went back to the grooming, and they were both smiling at the horses. December came in with less severity than the previous year, though with enough cold to matter, and the Christmas social at the church was attended by the Wallace family as a unit for the first time. Charlotte standing with Louis and Tobias eating Eunice's apple cake, and talking to neighbors with the ease of people who are exactly where they belong. The land agent's wife asked Charlotte directly if she planned to stay with the school, and Charlotte said yes, and the woman looked surprised and then approving, and Louis, who was beside Charlotte, said without particular emphasis but with an unmistakable quality, "She's the best teacher this county has had." It would be the county's loss to lose her to convention. The land agent's wife agreed vigorously. Charlotte squeezed Louis's hand. January of 1884 brought news from California in the form of a letter from Daniel Wallace. He was alive. He was in Sacramento. He had not found silver but had found steady work as a surveyor and was doing reasonably well and was sorry, the letter said, with the awkward brevity of a man who knew the apology was insufficient, for his long absence. He asked after Tobias. Louis read the letter twice, sitting at the kitchen table in the morning, and Charlotte sat across from him and watched him process it. "He's alive," Louis said in a tone that was carefully neutral. "He is," Charlotte said. "He's been alive this whole time," Louis said. "Then I'm angry." "That's reasonable," Charlotte said. "Tobias has been here for 3 years without word from his father," Louis said. "Mary died and Daniel didn't know because I didn't know where to write." "Are you going to tell Tobias?" Louis looked up. "Yes, I'm going to tell him tonight. He needs to know his father is alive." Tobias took the news with the careful composure that was his nature, sitting at the supper table with his hands flat on the wood, and Charlotte watched him think through it with the same methodical process he applied to arithmetic, reaching the answer by working the steps. "He's not coming back," Tobias said. "It was not a question." "I don't know," Louis said honestly. "The letter doesn't say." "He didn't ask about Aunt Mary," Tobias said. Louis was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "he didn't." Tobias nodded slowly. Then he said, "I don't think I want to go to Sacramento." "No one is asking you to," Louis said. "I want to stay here," Tobias said. He looked from Louis to Charlotte, those dark, steady eyes. "This is home." "Yes," Louis said. "It is." Charlotte reached across the table and put her hand over Tobias's, and he turned his over and held it briefly and then, with the dignity of an 11-year-old who has processed a significant thing, picked up his fork again. Louis wrote back to Daniel. The correspondence that followed over the next several months was irregular and factual, and did not resolve into a close relationship, but it resolved into a working one. Daniel was not returning to New Mexico territory, and this became clear by the summer of 1884. Louis set about formalizing what had been informal, the legal guardianship of Tobias, which had always been understood and never been documented. The lawyer from Cimarron came through in August, and the papers were signed, and Charlotte signed them too as Tobias's guardian. And when the lawyer had gone and it was just the three of them in the ranch kitchen, Tobias looked at the papers on the table and said, with the particular gravity of someone naming something true for the first time, "So it's official." "Official," Louis agreed. "Good," Tobias said. The spring of 1884 also brought the news that Charlotte was expecting, which she told Louis on a Tuesday morning in March while they were drinking coffee on the porch in the early light. He was very still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her, and his face had that expression she loved most, the one with everything in it. "When?" he asked. "October," she said. He set down his cup and took her hand in both of his and held it with the careful reverence of a man receiving something he had not been certain he would have again. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Well," she said, "surprised, and very well." He raised her hand and pressed it to his lips and closed his eyes for a moment, and Charlotte felt the love in it and the history in it and the particular weight of a man who has lost and is being given back. "I'm going to worry about you," he said. "I know," she said. "Try to worry in moderation." "I'll do my best," he said, which was an honest answer and not a promise, and she appreciated the honesty. She kept teaching through June and stopped in July when the summer heat was full, and her energy was not what it had been. And she spent the summer months at the ranch in a state of creative enterprise, because Charlotte Mercer was constitutionally unable to be idle, and she organized the ranch's record-keeping system, which Louis had maintained with efficiency, but without the particular pleasure of organization, and began compiling a primer of the territory's natural history from the essays and letters she had accumulated in her first 2 years, which she intended as a supplementary reader for the school. The baby was born in mid-October, which was something Charlotte would later note with the private satisfaction of a woman whose timing works out, because October was the most beautiful month in the territory, and the morning her son arrived the light through the bedroom window was the most extraordinary shade of gold she had ever seen it. He was born at the ranch with the assistance of the doctor from Cimarron, who arrived with enough time to matter, and Eunice Barlow, who arrived with enough food to feed the whole of Dusty Creek, and who was, it turned out, the steadiest presence in a room that Charlotte had ever been grateful for. Louis was in the room when it happened and after, and Charlotte, who was exhausted and very clearly herself, looked at her husband holding his son with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something new, something that was beyond the love she knew and was its own complete thing, and she understood in that moment the particular expansion of a heart that thought it knew its full capacity and finds there is more. They named him Thomas, after no one in particular, which Charlotte insisted on, because she did not want him to be anyone's memorial, only himself. Thomas Louis Wallace, born October 1884 in New Mexico Territory, 7 pounds and 4 ounces and a disposition, according to the doctor, of remarkable calm. Tobias, who had been waiting in the kitchen with the sustained tension of a boy whose composure had been tested by hours of uncertainty, was brought in to meet his cousin and regarded the infant with the careful analytical attention of someone doing a full assessment. "He's very small," Tobias said. "They start that way," Charlotte said. "He looks like Louis," Tobias said. "He has my forehead," Charlotte said. Tobias considered the baby's forehead with evident seriousness. "Maybe," he said. Then, after a pause, with the straightforward directness of someone who has decided to say the true thing, "He's going to be all right. I'll look after him." Charlotte looked at Tobias, this extraordinary 12-year-old who had navigated grief and absence and change with a dignity that humbled her, and said, "I know you will." Thomas was, as the doctor had predicted, a calm baby. He ate well and slept in stretches and regarded the world from a very early age with wide gray eyes that were unmistakably Louis's, and he became the particular sunlight of the Wallace household, the thing that gathered everyone toward it naturally and without effort. Charlotte returned to teaching in January with Thomas in a basket in the schoolroom, which Gerald Holt accepted with the quiet relief of a man who knew when a battle wasn't worth having. And the children took turns being gravely responsible about the baby in the corner. And Tobias, who came to school with Charlotte each morning, was the most capable of the unofficial attendants, reading while Thomas slept and making faces at precisely the right moments to prevent crying. The school year of 1885 had 15 students. Charlotte had written to the Territorial Education Board in Santa Fe about resources, had received some books and a letter of encouragement, and had submitted a proposal for a second classroom expansion that was still under review, but that she was not worried about, because she had learned in the territory that things worth having were worth persistent asking. March of 1885 brought a week of storms that kept everyone close, and Louis and Charlotte spent 3 days essentially confined to the house with a healthy 4-month-old and a 13-year-old who had read everything in the house twice. And the storms outside were magnificent, lightning over the mesa at night, and the creek running high and fast, and the smell of wet sage coming through every gap in the walls. On the second evening, with Thomas asleep and Tobias deep in a mapping project he had invented for himself, Louis and Charlotte sat by the stove and Louis said, "I want to tell you something." Charlotte looked at him. "I want you to know," he said, measuring his words in the careful way he did when something mattered, "that what I have now is the best thing I've ever had, not instead of what was before, in addition to it, the way you said to Tobias." He looked at her steadily. "I was afraid that saying that would feel like a betrayal. I've thought about it for a long time, and I've decided that it doesn't. That love isn't a fixed quantity that gets divided. That Mary and what I had with her is whole and complete on its own, and what I have with you is whole and complete on its own, and they don't subtract from each other. They just both exist." Charlotte held his gaze and felt the weight of what he was saying, what it had cost him to arrive at it, the work of those months and years. "I know," she said, "and I feel the same about what I've had to grieve and what I have with you. They're separate, both real, both whole." He reached for her, and she moved into his arms, and they sat by the stove while the storm worked on the territory outside. And the house was warm and full of the sounds of a sleeping baby and a working boy, and the creek running hard below the ridge. And Louis rested his cheek against her hair, and she felt his breath slow into the rhythm of a man entirely at peace. Spring came back, the way it always did, reliable and transforming. The cottonwoods put out their green, and the mesa road dried out, and Charlotte took Sunday out for the first Saturday ride of the season with Thomas in the carrier she had made for exactly this purpose, a padded contraption that Louis had regarded with skepticism, and that had proven itself entirely effective. And Thomas faced forward against her chest and looked at the territory with the wide-eyed astonishment of someone encountering it for the first time, which he was. Louis rode beside her on Calero, and Tobias rode Pepper, the bay horse he had graduated to from Sunday, now that Thomas occasionally needed Sunday on Saturday mornings, and the four of them rode south along the Mesa Road in the April light, and it was one of those ordinary, extraordinary days that you know even while they're happening are the kind you keep. They rode up to the ridge that Saturday, all of them. It was the first time Louis had brought more than one person to the ridge. the first time it held more than 2 people at once, and he stood at the edge in the spring light with his son against his wife's chest and his nephew on a bay horse beside him, and the three-county view was exactly what it had always been and also completely different. Charlotte looked at him looking at it. His face was open. Not the careful, composed mask of the man she had met 14 months ago, not the private grief of the widower in the stable, but something fully present and fully feeling, a man inhabiting his own life completely. She had done that, and he had done it for her. And neither of them had done it alone. "What are you thinking?" she asked him. He turned and looked at her and Thomas and the view and said that she would have liked all of this. Charlotte smiled. "She would have. And that I'm not afraid anymore," he said. Thomas, as though in response, made the particular sound he made when he was pleased with something, a small bright noise that Tobias had started calling his weather report because it generally indicated good conditions. Tobias laughed, which he did more easily now, and Louis caught Charlotte's eye and the smile came out fully, the real one, and she felt it the way she always felt it, like a change in the light. The Wallace Ranch ran well that year and the year after. Louis expanded the south pasture and brought on a ranch hand named Aurelio, who was 23 and from a family near Santa Fe, and who proved himself capable and trustworthy within a week and became a fixture of the operation. Charlotte's natural history primer was accepted by the Territorial Education Board as supplementary material and printed in a small edition that was distributed to 6 schools, which Charlotte was quietly proud of in a way she did not entirely conceal. Tobias turned 14 in the fall of 1885 and was by then so thoroughly an extension of the ranch that Louis had begun formally teaching him the operational side of things, the books and the grazing rotations and the market decisions, which Tobias absorbed with his characteristic efficiency and occasional opinion, which Louis received with more patience than Charlotte suspected most fathers managed. Thomas turned 1 year old in October 1885 and celebrated by taking his first steps across the kitchen floor toward Tobias, who had been trying to coax this result for weeks and who received the achievement with an expression of pure triumphant joy. In the December of 1885, Charlotte found that she was expecting again, which she told Louis in the same place she had told him the first time, on the porch in the early morning with coffee in their hands. This time he laughed, which was not what she had expected, a genuine and delighted laugh, and then he said, "When?" "July," she said. "Summer, baby," he said. "So it appears," she said, and they drank their coffee in the morning light with the particular contentment of people who have built something real and are watching it grow. The July baby was a girl. She came at the hottest point of the summer, which Charlotte found deeply ironic but bore with more grace than she'd have predicted. And when she arrived, she had Charlotte's dark eyes and Louis's set to the jaw, and she wailed with a vigor that the doctor said indicated excellent lungs, and that Tobias, from the kitchen, heard and declared she was going to be loud. He was right. She was. They named her Eliza Ruth Wallace, after Charlotte's mother and no one else, which felt right and complete, and was the easiest naming decision they had made. With 2 small children, a working ranch, a school, and a 14-year-old who needed the particular attention of someone who was becoming an adult, the Wallace household was full in every sense of the word. It was also, Charlotte thought on countless mornings and evenings and middle-of-the-night moments, the most alive she had ever felt. She had not known that you could be this tired and this happy at the same time. She had not known that love could be this domestic and this daily and still carry its full weight, that the person across the breakfast table could still, 3 years on, be the most interesting thing in her day. The town of Dusty Creek expanded incrementally, the way frontier towns did when the territory was settling and the cattle trade was establishing its patterns. A second general store arrived, and then a telegraph office, and then a dentist who came through quarterly, and the school enrollment grew to 18 and then 20, and Charlotte's proposal for the classroom extension was finally approved in the spring of 1887, and the building went up over 3 weekends with the assistance of half the men in town, including Louis and Aurelio, and old Pete Garza and Tobias, who at 15 was now large enough to be genuinely useful with a hammer. Charlotte stood in the new classroom on the morning of the first school day after the extension was complete and felt the particular satisfaction of something argued for and achieved. She ran the school for 5 more years after that, until Thomas was old enough for school himself, and the conflict of interest was too comic to continue, and she stepped back from the primary role with the satisfaction of someone who had done the thing fully and completely and left it better than she found it. The school had 23 students by then, a second teacher named Miss Delgado who was 22 and sharp and good with the younger ones, and Charlotte remained involved as a resource and advisor and general presence, which suited everyone. The territory became a state in 1912, which was more than 20 years after Charlotte and Louis married, but they were both still there to see it, older and slower and still very much themselves, standing on the porch of the Wallace Ranch in the October light, while the news moved through Dusty Creek on the telegraph wire, and people made noise about it in town. Louis read the telegram that Tobias brought out on horseback, because Tobias was 37 by then and ran the North Range operation and still rode Calero's grandson, and he handed the telegram to Charlotte and she read it too. "New Mexico," she said. "Finally," Louis said. They stood on the porch and looked at the ridge above the creek bend, as they had stood on countless other evenings, and the view was the same as it had always been, wide and deep and impervious to the small human business of dates and names, and they were the same in the ways that mattered, which was to say that he was still the most direct person she had ever known, and she was still the most honest, and between those two things they had built a life that held everything. The losses they had brought to it, and the love they had grown in it, and the children who were grown and making their own lives, and the land that was faithful and constant beneath all of it. Thomas was 26 that October and had gone to Albuquerque for law studies, a fact that Louis had regarded with initial bewilderment and eventual deep pride. Eliza was 24 and had married the previous spring, a young man from Cimarron named Robert Salazar who ran cattle and had proved himself to Louis and Charlotte over 2 cautious years before the matter was settled. They had a baby boy named James who was 7 months old and who had Charlotte's eyes and everyone else's opinion, generously distributed. Tobias, who had never entirely needed the outside world and had found what he needed on the Wallace land, was the anchor of the operation, steady and capable, and more like Louis every year in the best possible ways. He had married in 1899, a woman named Rosa from the Garza family, who was 24 to his 27, and who was warm and practical, and who had produced 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who were currently in school with Miss Delgado's successor, and were, by Charlotte's thoroughly unbiased assessment, exceptional. On the anniversary of their 25th year of marriage, Louis saddled 2 horses in the early morning and told Charlotte to put on her riding clothes. She looked at him. "The ridge," he said. She put on her riding clothes. They rode up in the September morning, the 2 of them, the way they had first ridden up 25 years before, and the road was more worn now, and the juniper on the slopes was taller, but the ridge was the same, and the view was the same, and the light was doing its ordinary, extraordinary work in the September sky. Charlotte stood on the ridge and looked west and thought about the morning. She had stepped off the stage in Dusty Creek in 1882 with a carpet bag and a letter, and no particular plan, beyond getting somewhere large enough to rebuild in. She thought about the stable and the first look and the careful gradual building of one conversation at a time. She thought about the ridge the first time, the 2 horses standing side by side and his hand over hers in the fading light. Louis stood beside her, and she felt him standing there the way you feel someone whose presence has been the landscape of your life for a quarter century, not separate from the world around you but part of it. 25 years, she said. 25 years, he agreed. "Any regrets?" she asked, not because she doubted but because she liked to hear him answer it. He turned and looked at her with that direct gray gaze, and she saw in it every version of him she had known. The composed man in the stable, the careful man at the schoolhouse door, the afraid man on the ridge telling her he was afraid, the man who had given her the best years of her life one steady day at a time. "None," he said. "Not one." Charlotte turned back to the view, to the 3 counties wide and the mesa and the red rock and the river silver in the distance, and she said, "She was right about this place. It's big enough to hold everything." "Yes," Louis said. He took her hand and she held it, the same hand she had held at the top of the world 25 years before, worn now and sure and entirely familiar, and they stood together on the ridge in the September light. And the territory lay out before them in its endless patient way, and everything was exactly as it should be. Below them, down the ridge road, the Wallace ranch sat in its crook of land with the creek running and the cottonwoods in their first autumn gold, and smoke was coming from the kitchen chimney because Tobias's Rosa was cooking. And if you listened you could hear the children on the lower slope somewhere, that particular sound of children who are entirely at home in the land they are growing up on. Charlotte listened to them for a moment, those small distant voices in the big country, and felt the fullness of it, the complete and perfect fullness of a life that had been built with care and love and the particular courage of 2 people who had been broken and had chosen, against the evidence, to be open again. Louis squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. The ridge held them, as it always had, as it always would, and the view went on to the horizon and beyond, and there was nothing more to ask for and nothing left to fear.